The Caribbean Sea is once again the center of a dangerous standoff, a region whose history is marked by conflict and competition among global powers. On September 9, 2025, tensions between the United States and Venezuela have reached a breaking point, sending shockwaves through the region and beyond. What began as a routine anti-drug operation has rapidly escalated into a full-blown military standoff, with fighter jets roaring overhead and heavily armed troops stationed along Venezuela's coastlines ready for anything. This isn't just a local dispute, it's a crisis with global stakes, drawing in world powers, international organizations, and threatening to destabilize the entire region. Years of mutual suspicion and bitter accusations have set the stage for this moment. The U.S. accuses President Maduro of corruption, human rights abuses, and drug trafficking, while Venezuela claims the U.S. is orchestrating a campaign for regime change and interfering in its sovereignty. A deadly U.S. raid at sea has triggered a massive Venezuelan military mobilization, with tanks rolling out and troops on high alert, raising the risk of open conflict to levels not seen in decades. To truly understand this crisis, we must look deeper at the actions, motives, and political context on both sides, and the long history of mistrust that fuels today's confrontation. Why did the U.S. choose to escalate now, risking a wider conflict in such a volatile region? How is President Maduro using the threat of foreign intervention to rally support at home and tighten his grip on power? And how are neighboring countries like Brazil and Colombia responding as they brace for the possibility of conflict spilling across their borders? The world is watching anxiously as this high-stakes confrontation unfolds, with the lives and futures of millions of people hanging in the balance and the potential for a humanitarian crisis looming large. Let's break down the key events, the motivations driving each side, and the possible outcomes of this perilous standoff, one that could reshape the future of the Caribbean and beyond. The latest escalation began with a bold and unmistakable display of American military might, sending a clear message to both allies and adversaries in the region. In early September, the U.S. deployed 10 of its most advanced fighter jets to Puerto Rico, dramatically reinforcing a military presence that already included over 4,000 troops and a fleet of naval warships stationed nearby. The arrival of these jets marked a significant increase in American firepower and signaled a new phase of military readiness in the Caribbean. Officially, the Pentagon stated the move was to intensify the fight against powerful drug cartels exploiting Caribbean sea routes. The U.S. military ramped up patrols, intercepting suspicious vessels and increasing surveillance across the region's turquoise waters. President Trump framed this as a renewed war on drugs, but the timing raised eyebrows. The deployment came just days after a deadly U.S. raid on a Venezuelan naval vessel, which left at least 11 sailors dead and heightened tensions between Washington and Caracas. Trump insisted the goal wasn't regime change, but in Caracas, anxiety and suspicion only grew. Many Venezuelans saw the buildup as a direct threat to their sovereignty, sparking protests and heated debates in the capital. The U.S. has long accused Venezuela of being a narco state, even going so far as to indict President Nicolas Maduro as the alleged head of the so-called Cartel de los Soles, a shadowy network said to control much of the country's drug trade. In a dramatic move, the Trump administration recently doubled the reward for Maduro's capture to $50 million, signaling a new level of pressure and determination to bring him to justice. Behind the scenes, Pentagon officials hinted at the possibility of further military action, including potential airstrikes or covert operations inside Venezuela, fueling speculation about Washington's true intentions. The deployment of these jets isn't just about surveillance or deterrence. It's about positioning American forces for potential operations that could ignite a much wider conflict, with consequences for the entire region. The Caribbean is now on edge, its people and governments watching every move for signs of further escalation as the world wonders what the next step will be. With tensions at a boiling point, the stakes have never been higher, and the world holds its breath as events unfold. Venezuela responded swiftly to the U.S. military buildup. President Maduro ordered a massive troop mobilization along the coast and borders, signaling readiness to defend against any incursion. Defense Minister Padrino announced 25,000 troops deployed to strategic areas, transforming the northern coastline into a militarized zone. The message, Venezuela will not be intimidated, and any foreign intervention will be met with force. Maduro also mobilized civilian militias, warning of armed struggle if attacked, while still calling for dialogue to avoid war. This dual approach, preparing for conflict while urging peace, aims to rally domestic support and appear reasonable internationally. The government frames the crisis as a fight for sovereignty, rejecting U.S. anti-drug operations near its territory. The nation is on high alert, bracing for whatever comes next. The standoff is now a test of resolve on both sides. At the heart of the standoff are two clashing narratives, each deeply rooted in history and national identity. For the U.S., this is a just war on drugs. Venezuela is painted as a narco-state, and military action is framed as self-defense. American officials argue that the flow of illegal drugs from Venezuela fuels addiction and violence on U.S. streets, making intervention not just a choice, but a necessity. The U.S. points to convictions and indictments of Venezuelan officials as proof, labeling the Cartel de los Soles a terrorist group to justify aggressive tactics. These legal actions are broadcast as evidence of a criminal regime, reinforcing the narrative that the U.S. is upholding international law. The message is clear: America is fighting criminals to protect its citizens, families, and way of life. The war on drugs is portrayed as a moral crusade, with the safety of American communities at stake. Venezuela, meanwhile, sees itself under siege, its sovereignty threatened by a superpower. Maduro's government denies all drug allegations, calling them a pretext for U.S. intervention and a grab for oil. Officials insist that the real motive is control over Venezuela's vast natural resources, not justice or security. Every U.S. action, from sanctions to military deployments, is used to rally the population against foreign aggression. State media amplifies these moves, warning of imperialist threats and external enemies. The government taps into national pride, framing the crisis as a fight for self-determination. Patriotic symbols and slogans fill the streets, uniting citizens against what they see as an existential threat. For Caracas, this isn't about drugs. It's about defending the homeland from a powerful aggressor. The narrative is one of resistance, not criminality. Both sides use these stories to justify their actions and harden public opinion, fueling a cycle of mistrust and escalation. The result? A deadlock, with each side convinced of its own righteousness, unwilling to compromise or see the other's perspective. The truth is lost in the fog of propaganda as both nations dig in, and the world watches, uncertain of what comes next. The roots of today's crisis run deep. Decades of sanctions, accusations, and failed diplomacy have left the U.S. and Venezuela locked in mutual suspicion. Washington sees Maduro as an illegitimate dictator. Caracas views every U.S. move as an attempt at regime change. Sanctions and indictments have isolated Venezuela, but also given Maduro a scapegoat for economic hardship. The legacy of Hugo Chávez's anti-American stance and alliances with U.S. rivals only deepened the divide. This history creates a feedback loop. Each action justifies the next, making de-escalation nearly impossible. With no trust or reliable communication, every move is seen as a threat, pushing both nations closer to confrontation. The crisis is sending shockwaves across Latin America and beyond. Brazil has voiced alarm, warning that U.S. military moves threaten the region's peace. Colombia, despite its own tensions with Maduro, fears war could unleash refugees and chaos along its border. For neighbors, the risks of conflict far outweigh any potential benefits. Global powers are also weighing in. China and Russia back Venezuela, seeing U.S. pressure as a challenge to their influence. China's calls for non-interference and cooperation are thinly veiled criticism of U.S. actions. This international split emboldens Maduro and complicates U.S. efforts. The lack of consensus makes a peaceful solution harder to achieve. The world is divided and the region is on edge. The chorus of concern grows louder as the threat of war looms. The risk of sudden escalation is dangerously real. With U.S. and Venezuelan forces operating in close quarters, a single mistake could trigger open conflict. Reports suggest the U.S. is considering targeted strikes inside Venezuela, moves that would be seen as acts of war. Any retaliation could quickly spiral into a broader, unpredictable conflict. Critics question the legality of U.S. actions, warning that blurring the line between law enforcement and warfare sets a dangerous precedent. Even without a full invasion, continued military pressure could destabilize the region for years. Criminal networks and guerrilla groups would thrive in the chaos. The costs of intervention would be immense, with no easy solutions. The world has seen how quickly such crises can spiral out of control. The stakes are nothing less than regional stability. Behind the headlines, it's ordinary Venezuelans who suffer most. Years of economic collapse have left millions hungry, sick, or fleeing the country. War would bring new horrors, airstrikes, blockades, and even deeper humanitarian crisis. The threat alone disrupts daily life, closing schools and businesses, and fueling fear. Soldiers on both sides face deadly risks, many fighting for governments they may not trust. The focus on military solutions distracts from urgent needs, diplomacy, aid, and real reform. The world must choose: escalate the conflict, or prioritize the well-being of the Venezuelan people. The human cost is real, and the time for peaceful solutions is running out. As of September 9, 2025, the Caribbean remains on edge. The U.S. and Venezuela are locked in a cycle of escalation, with peace hanging by a thread. Each side clings to its narrative: war on drugs versus defense of sovereignty, leaving little room for compromise. Regional and global reactions are split, complicating any path to peace. The risk of accidental or deliberate conflict is high, with catastrophic consequences for millions. The legal and ethical lines are blurred, and the human cost would far outweigh any strategic gain. Yet, calls for dialogue and de-escalation offer a glimmer of hope. The only real solution lies in diplomacy and a focus on the Venezuelan people. The world is watching, hoping leaders choose peace over war.